Hi, I'm Baljit Kaur, and I am a research assistant on the Recovery Histories project. So prior to this project, I spent some years working with vulnerable and marginalized communities. So I worked with marginalized young people. I also worked with women and children who had experienced domestic and sexual violence. That's my professional background, and both of these areas uh, have shaped my academic research interests. So when I was working with women and children, I became quite curious and interested, and also concerned about access to therapy and availability of therapy for especially amongst working class people who'd experienced domestic and sexual violence. So at that point, I think I was already quite interested in people's journeys of recovery. At the same time, I was volunteering at a youth club in East London, and was quite interested in their creative programs. I particularly took an interest in the music programs there. And I was quite interested in the way in which young people were using these programs and using music as a tool to speak to their experiences of violence, and share them with other people, and what that did in their sort of journeys post experiences of violence. So these two areas combined really shaped and informed the questions that I wanted to ask through my research. So questions like, to what extent do young people use music to tell their stories of violence, and also how viable these programs are as community interventions for marginalized young people. I was also interested in how these programs were shaped by the funding that they received and who they received it from, and how in turn this shaped how this shapes rap culture. So some of the findings that emerged amongst young men were narratives around the streets, around the struggle, and also around structural and institutional violence. This was more or less the same for young women, but with the addition of experiences of domestic and sexual violence, which were less readily talked about in the music studio. And one of the reasons for that was really about the gender dynamics in that space. So my research interests more broadly are around creative and qualitative methodologies, youth culture, cultural production, experiences of violence, and abolitionism in the context of gender-based violence. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to working in this strand, the ethnographic strand, because I really enjoy immersing myself in the fieldwork process, and in this project, immersing myself in the lives of our participants, who are survivors of child sexual abuse. So one of the challenges that I find, undoubtedly, is the complex and complicated emotions that emerge when researching this topic. It's quite difficult to anticipate when they might surface, so you might expect them to emerge when you're doing your fieldwork or when you're reading a difficult text, for example, but sometimes they do also creep up when you're washing the dishes, for example. So it's really about kind of taking care of yourself, and being compassionate with yourself and each other in the team too. Another challenge that I would say is kind of the access to organisations that support survivors of child sexual abuse, which I think has been quite difficult, especially in the early stages of this project. And I think that that has a lot to do with funding, resources, time, the capacity that practitioners have in taking on research projects, and the space for researchers to do this work. So at this stage, it's about kind of recognizing and acknowledging these challenges and these difficulties. But also, in a way, it's helped us to approach this particular strand differently, and in more creative ways. So, I've recently published on young people's experiences of violence in the Neoliberal Youth Club. In this particular piece, I was questioning the viability of creative programs in the youth club for young people who are economically marginalized. So, my argument was really about whether or the extent of the benefits of these programs in the long term for young people who are marginalized, economically marginalized, against the backdrop of structural inequalities, structural violence and inequalities.